Question 26, Part 1, of Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae, Treatise on the Theological Virtues, the Virtue of Charity. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Summa Theologica Secunda Secundae, Treatise on the Theological Virtues, the Virtue of Charity, by St. Thomas Aquinas, translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican Province. Question 26, of the Order of Charity in 13 Articles. Part 1, Articles 1 through 6. We must now consider the order of charity, under which head there are 13 points of inquiry. First, whether there is an order in charity. Second, whether man ought to love God more than his neighbor. Third, whether more than himself. Fourth, whether he ought to love himself more than his neighbor. Fifth, whether man ought to love his neighbor more than his own body. Sixth, whether he ought to love one neighbor more than another. Seventh, whether he ought to love more a neighbor who is better, or one who is more closely united to him. Eighth, whether he ought to love more one who is akin to him by blood, or one who is united to him by other ties. Ninth, whether out of charity a man ought to love his son more than his father. Tenth, whether he ought to love his mother more than his father. 11th, whether he ought to love his wife more than his father or mother. 12th, whether we ought to love those who are kind to us more than those whom we are kind to. 13th, whether the order of charity endures in heaven. First article, whether there is an order in charity. Objection 1. It would seem that there is no order in charity. For charity is a virtue. But no order is assigned to the other virtues. Neither, therefore, should any order be assigned to charity. Objection 2. Further, just as the object of faith is the first truth, so is the object of charity the sovereign good. Now no order is appointed for faith, but all things are believed equally. Neither, therefore, ought there be any order in charity. Objection 3. Further, charity is in the will, whereas ordering belongs not to the will, but to the reason. Therefore no order should be ascribed to charity. On the contrary, it is written (Canticles 2:4): "He brought me into the cellar of wine, he set in order charity in me." I answer that, as the Philosopher says (Metaph. v, 16), the terms before and after are used in reference to some principle. Now order implies that certain things are, in some way, before or after. Hence wherever there is a principle, there must needs be also order of some kind. But it has been said above (Q. 23, A. 1, and Q. 25, A. 12) that the love of charity tends to God as to the principle of happiness, on the fellowship of which the friendship of charity is based. Consequently, there must needs be some order in things loved, out of charity, which order is in reference to the first principle of that love, which is God. Reply Obj. 1: Charity tends toward the last end considered as last end, and this does not apply to any other virtue, as stated above (Q. 23, A. 6). Now the end has the character of principle in matters of appetite and action, as was shown above (Q. 23, A. 7, ad 2), and in Pars Prima Secundae, A. 1, ad 1). Wherefore charity, above all, implies relation to the first principle, and consequently, in charity above all, we find an order in reference to the first principle. Reply Obj. 2: Faith pertains to the cognitive power, whose operation depends on the thing known being in the knower. On the other hand, charity is in an appetitive power, whose operation consists in the soul tending to things themselves. Now order is to be found in things themselves, and flows from them into our knowledge. Hence order is more appropriate to charity than to faith. And yet there is a certain order in faith, in so far as it is chiefly about God, and secondarily about things referred to God. Reply Obj. 3: Order belongs to reason as the faculty that orders, and to the appetitive power as to the faculty which is ordered. It is in this way that order is stated to be in charity. Second article: Whether God ought to be loved more than our neighbor? Objection 1: It would seem that God ought not to be loved more than our neighbor. For it is written in 1 John 4:20: "He that loveth not his brother whom he seeth, how can he love God, whom he seeth not?" Whence it seems to follow that the more a thing is visible, the more lovable it is, since loving begins with seeing, according to Ethic. ix, 5, 12. Now God is less visible than our neighbor. Therefore He is less lovable, out of charity, than our neighbor. Obj. 2: Further, likeness causes love, according to Ecclus. 13:19: "Every beast loveth its like." Now man bears more likeness to his neighbor than to God. Therefore man loves his neighbor out of charity more than he loves God. Obj. 3: Further, what charity loves in a neighbor is God, according to Augustine (De Doctr. Christ. i, 22, 27). Now God is not greater in Himself than He is in our neighbor. Therefore He is not more to be loved in Himself than in our neighbor. Therefore we ought not to love God more than our neighbor. On the contrary, a thing ought to be loved more, if others ought to be hated on its account. Now we ought to hate our neighbor for God's sake, if, to wit, he leads us astray from God, according to Luke 14:26: "If any man come to me and hate not his father and mother and wife and children and brethren and sisters, he cannot be my disciple." Therefore we ought to love God, out of charity, more than our neighbor. I answer that, each kind of friendship regards chiefly the subject in which we chiefly find the good on the fellowship of which that friendship is based. Thus civil friendship regards chiefly the ruler of the state, on whom the entire common good of the state depends. Hence to him, before all, the citizens owe fidelity and obedience. Now the friendship of charity is based on the fellowship of happiness, which consists essentially in God, as the first principle, whence it flows to all who are capable of happiness. Therefore God ought to be loved chiefly and before all out of charity. For He is loved as the cause of happiness, whereas our neighbor is loved as receiving together with us a share of happiness from Him. Reply to Obj. 1: A thing is a cause of love in two ways. First, as being the reason for loving. In this way good is the cause of love, since each thing is loved according to its measure of goodness. Secondly, a thing causes love, as being a way to acquire love. It is in this way that seeing is the cause of loving, not as though a thing were lovable according as it is visible, but because by seeing a thing we are led to love it. Hence it does not follow that what is more visible is more lovable, but that as an object of love we meet with it before others. And that is the sense of the Apostle's argument. For since our neighbor is more visible to us, he is the first lovable object we meet with, because "the soul learns from those things it knows, to love what it knows not," as Gregory says in a homily (Homily 11 on the Gospel). Hence it can be argued that, if any man loves not his neighbor, neither does he love God, not because his neighbor is more lovable, but because he is the first thing to demand our love, and God is more lovable by reason of His greater goodness. Reply to Obj. 2: The likeness we have to God precedes and causes the likeness we have to our neighbor, because from the very fact that we share along with our neighbor in something received from God, we become like to our neighbor. Hence by reason of this likeness we ought to love God more than we love our neighbor. Reply to Obj. 3: Considered in His substance, God is equally in all, in whomsoever He may be, for He is not lessened by being in anything. And yet our neighbor does not possess God's goodness equally with God, for God has it essentially, and our neighbor by participation. Third article: Whether out of charity man is bound to love God more than himself? Objection 1: It would seem that man is not bound out of charity to love God more than himself. For the Philosopher says (Ethic. ix, 8) that "a man's friendly relations with others arise from his friendly relations with himself." Now the cause is stronger than its effect. Therefore man's friendship towards himself is greater than his friendship for anyone else. Therefore he ought to love himself more than God. Obj. 2: Further, one loves a thing in so far as it is one's own good. Now the reason for loving a thing is more loved than the thing itself which is loved for that reason, even as the principles which are the reason for knowing a thing are more known. Therefore man loves himself more than any other good loved by him. Therefore he does not love God more than himself. Obj. 3: Further, a man loves God as much as he loves to enjoy God. But a man loves himself as much as he loves to enjoy God, since this is the highest good a man can wish for himself. Therefore man is not bound out of charity to love God more than himself. On the contrary, Augustine says (De Doctr. Christ. i, 22): "If thou oughtest to love thyself, not for thy own sake, but for the sake of him in whom is the rightest end of thy love, let no other man take offense if him also thou lovest for God's sake." Now the cause of a thing being such is yet more so. Therefore man ought to love God more than himself. I answer that, the good we receive from God is twofold: the good of nature and the good of grace. Now the fellowship of natural goods bestowed on us by God is the foundation of natural love, in virtue of which not only man, so long as his nature remains unimpaired, loves God above all things and more than himself, but also every single creature, in its own way, that is, either by an intellectual, or by a rational, or by an animal, or at least by a natural love, as stones do, for instance, and other things bereft of knowledge. Because each part naturally loves the common good of the whole more than its own particular good. This is evidenced by its operation, since the principal inclination of each part is towards common action conducive to the good of the whole. It may also be seen in civic virtues, whereby sometimes the citizens suffer damage even to their own property and persons for the sake of the common good. Wherefore much more is this realized with regard to the friendship of charity, which is based on the fellowship of the gifts of grace. Therefore man ought, out of charity, to love God, who is the common good of all, more than himself, since happiness is in God as in the universal and fountain, principle of all who are able to have a share of that happiness. Reply Obj. 1: The Philosopher is speaking of friendly relations toward another person in whom the good, which is the object of friendship, resides in some restricted way, and not of friendly relations with another in whom the aforesaid good resides in totality. Reply Obj. 2: The part does indeed love the good of the whole, as becomes a part, not however so as to refer the good of the whole to itself, but rather itself to the good of the whole. Reply Obj. 3: That a man wishes to enjoy God pertains to that love of God which is love of concupiscence. Now we love God with the love of friendship more than with the love of concupiscence, because the Divine good is greater in itself than our share of good in enjoying Him. Hence, out of charity, man simply loves God more than himself. Fourth article. Whether out of charity man ought to love himself more than his neighbor? Objection 1: It would seem that a man ought not, out of charity, to love himself more than his neighbor. For the principal object of charity is God, as stated above in A. 2 and in Q. 25, AA. 1, 12. Now sometimes our neighbor is more closely united to God than we are ourselves. Therefore we ought to love such a one more than ourselves. Obj. 2: Further, the more we love a person, the more we avoid injuring him. Now a man, out of charity, submits to injury for his neighbor's sake, according to Prov. 12:26: "He that neglecteth a loss for the sake of a friend is just." Therefore a man ought, out of charity, to love his neighbor more than himself. Obj. 3: Further, it is written (1 Cor. 13:5): "Charity seeketh not its own." Now the thing we love most is the one whose good we seek most. Therefore a man does not, out of charity, love himself more than his neighbor. On the contrary, It is written (Lev. 19:18 and in Matt. 22:39): "Thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself." Whence it seems to follow that man's love for himself is the model of his love for another. But the model exceeds the copy. Therefore, out of charity, a man ought to love himself more than his neighbor. I answer that, there are two things in man, his spiritual nature and his corporeal nature. And a man is said to love himself by reason of his loving himself regard to his spiritual nature, as stated above in Q. 25, A. 7. So that accordingly a man ought, out of charity, to love himself more than he loves any other person. This is evident from the very reason for loving, since, as stated above in Q. 25, AA. 1, 12, God is loved as the principle of good, on which the love of charity is founded; while man, out of charity, loves himself by reason of his being a partaker of the aforesaid good, and loves his neighbor by reason of his fellowship in that good. Now fellowship is a reason for love according to a certain union in relation to God. Wherefore, just as unity surpasses union, the fact that man himself has a share of the divine good is a more potent reason for loving than that another should be a partner with him in that share. Therefore man, out of charity, ought to love himself more than his neighbor, in sign whereof a man ought not to give way to any evil of sin, which counteracts his share of happiness, not even that he may free his neighbor from sin. Reply Obj. 1: The love of charity takes its quantity not only from its object, which is God, but also from the lover, who is the man that has charity, even as the quantity of any action depends in some way on the subject. Wherefore, though a better neighbor is nearer to God, yet because he is not as near to the man who has charity, as this man is to himself, it does not follow that a man is bound to love his neighbor more than himself. Reply Obj. 2: A man ought to bear bodily injury for his friend's sake, and precisely in so doing he loves himself more as regards his spiritual mind, because it pertains to the perfection of virtue, which is a good of the mind. In spiritual matters, however, man ought not to suffer injury by sinning, in order to free his neighbor from sin, as stated above. Reply Obj. 3: As Augustine says in his Rule (Ep. 211), the saying, "Charity seeks not her own," means that it prefers the common to the private good. Now the common good is always more lovable to the individual than his private good, even as the good of the whole is more lovable to the part than the latter's own partial good, as stated above in A. 3. Fifth article: Whether a man ought to love his neighbor more than his own body? Objection 1: It would seem that a man is not bound to love his neighbor more than his own body. For his neighbor includes his neighbor's body. If therefore a man ought to love his neighbor more than his own body, it follows that he ought to love his neighbor's body more than his own. Obj. 2: Further, a man ought to love his own soul more than his neighbor's, as stated above in A. 4. Now a man's own body is nearer to his soul than his neighbor. Therefore we ought to love our body more than our neighbor. Obj. 3: Further, a man imperils that which he loves less for the sake of what he loves more. Now every man is not bound to imperil his own body for his neighbor's safety. This belongs to the perfect, according to John 15:13: "Greater love than this no man hath, that a man lay down his life for his friends." Therefore a man is not bound, out of charity, to love his neighbor more than his own body. On the contrary, Augustine says On Christian Doctrine 127 that we ought to love our neighbor more than our own body. I answer that, out of charity we ought to love more that which has more fully the reason for being loved out of charity, as stated above (A. 2 and in Q. 25, A. 12). Now fellowship in the full participation of happiness, which is the reason for loving one's neighbor, is a greater reason for loving than the participation of happiness by way of overflow, which is the reason for loving one's own body. Therefore, as regards the welfare of the soul, we ought to love our neighbor more than our own body. Reply Obj. 1: According to the Philosopher (Ethic. ix, 8), a thing seems to be that which is predominant in it: so that when we say that we ought to love our neighbor more than our own body, this refers to his soul, which is his predominant part. Reply Obj. 2: Our body is nearer to our soul than our neighbor, as regards the constitution of our own nature. But as regards the participation of happiness, our neighbor's soul is more closely associated with our own soul than even our own body is. Reply Obj. 3: Every man is immediately concerned with the care of his own body, but not with his neighbor's welfare, except perhaps in cases of urgency. Wherefore charity does not necessarily require a man to imperil his own body for his neighbor's welfare, except in a case where he is under obligation to do so. And if a man of his own accord offer himself for that purpose, this belongs to the perfection of charity. Sixth article: Whether we ought to love one neighbor more than another. Objection 1: It would seem that we ought not to love one neighbor more than another. For Augustine says (On Christian Doctrine 128): "One ought to love all men equally. Since, however, one cannot do good to all, we ought to consider those chiefly who by reason of place, time, or any other circumstance, by a kind of chance, are more closely united to us." Therefore one neighbor ought not to be loved more than another. Obj. 2: Further, where there is one and the same reason for loving several, there should be no inequality of love. Now there is one and the same reason for loving all one's neighbors, which reason is God, as Augustine states (On Christian Doctrine 127). Therefore we ought to love all our neighbors equally. Obj. 3: Further, to love a man is to wish him good things, as the Philosopher states (Rhet. ii, 4). Now to all our neighbors we wish an equal good, viz. everlasting life. Therefore we ought to love all our neighbors equally. On the contrary, one's obligation to love a person is proportionate to the gravity of the sin one commits in acting against that love. Now it is a more grievous sin to act against the love of certain neighbors than against the love of others. Hence the commandment (Lev. 10:9): "He that curseth his father or mother, dying let him die," which does not apply to those who cursed others than the above. Therefore we ought to love some neighbors more than others. I answer that, there have been two opinions on this question. For some have said that we ought, out of charity, to love all our neighbors equally, as regards our affection, but not as regards the outward effect. They held that the order of love is to be understood as applying to outward favors, which we ought to confer on those who are connected with us in preference to those who are unconnected, and not to the inward affection, which ought to be given equally to all, including our enemies. But this is unreasonable. For the affection of charity, which is the inclination of grace, is not less orderly than the natural appetite, which is the inclination of nature, for both inclinations flow from divine wisdom. Now we observe in the physical order that the natural inclination in each thing is proportionate to the act or movement that is becoming to the nature of that thing. Thus in earth the inclination of gravity is greater than in water, because it is becoming to earth to be beneath water. Consequently, the inclination also of grace, which is the effect of charity, must needs be proportionate to those actions which have to be performed outwardly, so that, to wit, the affection of our charity be more intense toward those to whom we ought to behave with greater kindness. We must therefore say that, even as regards the affection, we ought to love one neighbor more than another. The reason is that, since the principle of love is God, and the person who loves, it must needs be that the affection of love increases in proportion to the nearness to one or the other of those principles. For as we stated above (A. 1), wherever we find a principle, order depends on relation to that principle. Reply to Obj. 1: Love can be unequal in two ways. First, on the part of the good we wish our friend. In this respect we love all men equally out of charity, because we wish them all one same generic good, namely everlasting happiness. Secondly, love is said to be greater through its action being more intense, and in this way we ought not to love all equally. Or we may reply that we have unequal love for certain persons in two ways. First, through our loving some and not loving others. As regards beneficence, we are bound to observe this inequality, because we cannot do good to all. But as regards benevolence, love ought not to be thus unequal. The other inequality arises from our loving some more than others, and Augustine does not mean to exclude the latter inequality, but the former, as is evident from what he says of beneficence. Reply to Obj. 2: Our neighbors are not all equally related to God. Some are nearer to Him, by reason of their greater goodness, and those we ought, out of charity, to love more than those who are not so near to Him. Reply to Obj. 3: This argument considers the quantity of love on the part of the good which we wish our friends. End of question 26, part 1. Read by Michael Shane Craig Lambert, LC.